In 1879, in a small German town called Ulm, a boy was born who would one day rewrite everything humanity thought it knew about the universe. The world would never be the same. And almost nothing about his childhood suggested what was coming. His parents were ordinary people. His father, Hermann, ran a small business selling electrical equipment. His mother, Pauline, loved music and books and pushed both into her son's hands early. By most measures, it was a quiet, unremarkable household. But Albert was not an ordinary child, and not in any flattering way. He didn't speak until he was nearly 3 years old. His family worried. His teachers wrote him off. One of them looked this quiet, awkward boy in the face and said, "You'll never amount to anything." Albert wasn't slow. He was somewhere else entirely. He was thinking. He had a habit, even as a very young child, of sitting completely still and watching the world as if he was trying to take it apart with his eyes. When he was 5, his father handed him a small compass. It was a simple gift, the kind you forget about by the next afternoon. Albert couldn't put it down. No matter how he turned it, no matter which direction he faced, the needle always pointed north. Something invisible was guiding it. He had no name for that force yet, but he needed one. He later said that experience shook him in a way he never fully recovered from. School arrived and made everything worse. German classrooms in the 1880s ran on discipline and memorization. You learned the answer. You repeated the answer. You did not ask why. Albert could not stop asking why. His teachers grew to dislike him, not because he was disruptive, but because his questions made them uncomfortable. He wanted to understand things, not just repeat them. That was considered a problem. The one subject that made sense to him was mathematics. His uncle Jakob, an engineer, used to frame equations like puzzles. He told Albert once, "Algebra is a merry science. We go hunting for a little animal we don't know, so we call it X." Albert loved that. He tore through math textbooks years ahead of his age. His mother pushed him toward music too, and he took up the violin. At first, he hated the practice, then he couldn't stop. By 15, his father's business had collapsed. The family packed up and moved to Italy, chasing better opportunities. Albert was left behind in Munich to finish school. He lasted a few months before he walked out. He couldn't stand the rules. He couldn't stand the way the teachers looked at him. He got a letter from a doctor saying his nerves were too fragile to continue. Whether that was true or not, nobody really knows. He used it to get out, and he left. Most people assumed he had thrown his future away, a 16-year-old dropout with no diploma and no plan. But Albert went to Italy, found his family, and kept reading. Physics, philosophy, mathematics. On his own schedule, at his own speed. At 16, he wrote his first scientific paper. It was rough and incomplete, but the thinking inside it was unlike anything produced by someone his age. He applied to the Swiss Federal Polytechnic in Zurich. He failed the entrance exam. He was 16, applying to a school that normally took 18-year-olds. His science scores were exceptional. His French was catastrophic. The school told him to go finish secondary school first and try again. He did exactly that, spending a year in a small Swiss town called Aarau. That year changed him. The school in Aarau was nothing like Germany. Teachers encouraged students to think visually, to imagine, to question. Albert thrived in a way he never had before. It was in Aarau that he asked himself the question that would define his life. What would it look like to ride alongside a beam of light? If you could somehow keep pace with it, what would you see? He had no answer. But the question lodged itself somewhere deep and refused to leave. In 1896, he got into the Polytechnic. But even at one of Europe's finest schools, Albert refused to follow the program. He skipped lectures he found useless. He borrowed the notes of a classmate named Marcel Grossman instead. Grossman would later help him save his career. Albert spent his free time in the physics lab and in his own head. His professors were frustrated. One called him smart but impossible to discipline. Another stopped calling on him in class altogether, but Albert was asking questions nobody on the faculty could answer. What is light, really? Does time move the same for everyone everywhere? What would it feel like to ride alongside a beam of light? These were not exam questions. They were obsessions. He also fell in love. Her name was Mileva Maric, the only woman in his physics program. She was Serbian, brilliant, and completely unimpressed by social convention. Albert was captivated immediately. They studied together, argued about physics together, wrote each other letters full of equations and declarations. Albert wrote to her, "How happy and proud I will be when we are together and can bring our work on relative motion to a conclusion." In 1900, Albert graduated, and then the real punishment began. He applied to university after university for a teaching or research position. Nobody would hire him. His professors, the ones whose lectures he had skipped, refused to recommend him. He wrote letter after letter. He received rejection after rejection. For nearly 2 years, Albert Einstein, who had just graduated from one of Europe's best physics programs, could not find a single job in science. He tutored children. He took temporary teaching posts. He watched his classmates move into research positions while he scrambled. Mileva failed her final exams twice. Their relationship was under enormous strain. She was pregnant. They were both broke. The future looked very small. Then in 1902, his old friend Marcel Grossmann stepped in. Grossmann's father knew the director of the Swiss Patent Office in Bern. A position had opened up. Albert applied. He got it. He was a technical expert third class. His job was to read patent applications and decide if the inventions were original. 8 hours a day, a clerk, invisible to the scientific world. He called it privately his thinking lab. He married Mileva in January 1903. They had a son, Hans Albert, shortly after. Life was tight. The apartment was small. Money was always short. His friends urged him to give up on physics and focus on the job. He refused. Every spare moment between patent reviews and lunch breaks and after the baby slept, Albert was at his desk with a notebook. Light, time, gravity, the nature of space. He had no laboratory, no research budget, no colleagues to bounce ideas off. Just a small wooden desk, a window, and the same questions he had been carrying since he was a boy staring at a compass needle that wouldn't explain itself. Nobody around him had any idea what was building inside that quiet apartment. In 1905, it broke open. Albert Einstein, 26 years old, patent clerk, published 4 scientific papers. In a single year, scientists would later call it the annus mirabilis, the miracle year. The first paper proved that atoms physically exist. At the time, many scientists still treated atoms as a useful idea, not a real thing. Albert's math settled the argument. Atoms were real. The second paper explained something called the photoelectric effect. It showed that light behaves like individual particles, not just waves. That single idea eventually won him the Nobel Prize. But he wasn't finished. The third paper introduced the special theory of relativity. Time, he argued, is not the same for everyone. It moves differently depending on how fast you are moving. Space itself was not the fixed, absolute stage that Newton had described. And from that paper came a short follow-up, almost an afterthought. A 3-page note containing the most recognizable equation ever written, E = mc². Energy and matter are the same thing, just in different forms. The scientific world didn't know what to do with him. A patent clerk with no university post had just dismantled the foundations of physics. The papers circulated slowly at first. Then the letters started arriving. Max Planck, one of the most respected physicists in Europe, read the relativity paper. He wrote to Albert immediately. Within a few years, universities that had refused to hire him were competing for him. He went from invisible to the most talked-about physicist on the continent. He left the patent office in 1909. He became a professor in Zurich, then in Prague, then back in Zurich. In 1914, he was offered a position at the Prussian Academy of Sciences in Berlin, the most prestigious scientific institution in the German-speaking world. He moved to Berlin in the summer of 1914. 6 weeks later, the First World War began. Europe collapsed into a conflict that would kill 17 million people. Albert, who had always hated nationalism, was horrified. While governments mobilized armies and scientists lined up to support their countries, Albert refused to sign a pro-war manifesto that was circulating among German academics. He signed a counter-declaration instead, calling for peace. It had 4 signatures, his was one of them. His marriage to Mileva had by now completely broken down. The years of poverty and struggle had worn them into different people. They separated in 1914. They divorced in 1919. Albert promised her the money from a Nobel Prize he hadn't won yet. He was that certain it was coming. During the war years, while the world tore itself apart, Albert sat in Berlin and finished the work he had started a decade earlier, the general theory of relativity. It was the most ambitious thing he had ever attempted. The special theory had dealt with objects moving at constant speeds. The general theory tackled acceleration and gravity. His conclusion was staggering. Gravity is not a force. It is a curvature in the fabric of space and time. Massive objects like the sun bend the space around them. Smaller objects like planets follow that curve. What we feel as gravity is simply the shape of the universe. He published the general theory in November 1915. But a theory, no matter how elegant, is just mathematics until someone tests it. The test came in 1919. A British astronomer named Arthur Eddington organized 2 expeditions to observe a solar eclipse, one in Brazil, one off the coast of Africa. The idea was simple. If Einstein was right, the sun's mass should bend light passing near it. Stars near the edge of the eclipsed sun should appear slightly out of position. The measurements would either confirm the theory or destroy it. The results came back. The stars had moved. Exactly as Einstein predicted. Gravity bent light. The universe was not what anyone had thought. The announcement was made at a meeting of the Royal Society in London. The president of the society called it one of the greatest achievements in the history of human thought. The next morning, Albert Einstein was on the front page of every major newspaper on the planet. He became something science had never quite produced before, a celebrity. Not just famous among scientists, famous everywhere. His face was on magazine covers. Crowds followed him through the streets. He was invited to lecture in America, in Britain, in France, in Japan. Thousands of people came to hear him speak, most of whom had no idea what he was actually saying. Albert found the whole thing genuinely baffling. He had remarried in 1919 to his cousin Elsa. Elsa was warm and practical and completely uninterested in physics. She managed his schedule, handled his correspondence, and kept the chaos at bay. Albert called her his indispensable helper. Through the 1920s, he traveled, lectured, and kept working. He pushed hard for peace between nations. He advocated for the rights of Jewish people across Europe. He saw what was building in Germany, and he didn't look away from it. By the early 1930s, the Nazi Party was rising fast. As a Jewish scientist, Albert was a specific kind of target. Nazi publications labeled his theories Jewish physics. A pamphlet appeared listing 100 scientists who rejected Einstein's work. Albert responded with characteristic dryness. He said, "If I were wrong, one would have been enough." But the danger was real. His books were burned. His bank account was seized. His name was put on lists. In December 1932, Albert left Germany to visit the United States. He never went back. When Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, Albert resigned from the Prussian Academy from across the Atlantic. He settled at the newly formed Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. It was a place built in part to shelter European intellectuals fleeing fascism. Albert became its most famous resident. He would spend the rest of his life there. Elsa died in 1936. Albert grew quieter after that. He became an American citizen in 1940. He kept working, kept sailing badly on the lake near his house, kept playing violin late into the evenings. In 1939, a group of physicists came to him with a problem. They had evidence that German scientists were close to building a nuclear weapon. They needed someone the American president would listen to. They needed Einstein. Albert signed a letter to Franklin Roosevelt warning of the danger. That letter helped launch what became the Manhattan Project. Albert himself had no role in building the bomb, but the physics that made it possible began with E equals mc squared. On August 6, 1945, the United States dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. Albert heard the news on the radio. He said only one word: whoa. He spent the rest of his life trying to undo what his fame had helped set in motion. He called for international control of nuclear weapons. He co-signed the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, urging world leaders to find peaceful means of resolving conflict before nuclear weapons ended the species. In his final years, he rarely left Princeton. He walked to his office at the Institute most mornings alone. Neighbors saw him on the street and he waved back, lost in thought. He was still working, still asking the same questions, bigger now. He wanted a unified field theory, one set of equations that could describe every force in the universe, gravity, electromagnetism, all of it, as expressions of a single underlying truth. He never found it. On April 17, 1955, an artery near his heart ruptured. He was taken to Princeton Hospital. He brought a notebook. He worked through the night on the unified theory. In the early hours of April 18th, Albert Einstein died. He was 76 years old. His last words were spoken quietly in German. The nurse beside him spoke no German. They were never recorded. He had asked that there be no funeral, no grave, no monument. His body was cremated. His ashes were scattered in a river. He left behind no estate worth mentioning. What he left was a different way of understanding where we are. A universe that bends under the weight of massive things. A universe where time moves at different speeds in different places. A universe that began with a single point and has been expanding ever since. A universe that turns out to be far stranger than anyone imagined. He started with the compass. A 5-year-old boy sitting still, staring at a needle that pointed north, and refusing to accept that the force behind it had no explanation. That boy never really stopped staring.